Welcome, searchers and seekers. We are in the first book of Kings, and we are dealing with the issue of the succession from David to, well, who will it be? It's not quite clear. It turns out to be Solomon. So here we have at the beginning of chapter 1 really a fascinating little story about King David. He was old and advanced in years, and he was cold, and he could not get warm. So the solution is that they're going to find a young virgin for the king. So this is King David. He has many wives, many concubines. And the solution is he has to find yet another woman. It has to be a young virgin. And they found someone throughout all of Israel. They searched and they found Abishag the Shunammite. So what is the purpose of telling the story about Abishag? Um, what is the rationale behind it? I think it shows, first of all, David's very old. So he's old, he's weak, he's not effectual. So yet again, this is another negative portrayal of David in the scriptures. But it sets the stage for what's going to happen. So he's not fully functioning. And another aspect of this, besides sort of the reduction of women to servants and providers for men, although in the text he says he did not know her, she sort of becomes his cuddle bunny. Not really a great way to present women, but David is seen as ineffectual. And again, which sets the stage for what's going to happen, but also is perhaps a criticism of David. And also, what is occurring is David did not set up someone to succeed him as king, apparently from the text. So we're going to see people are going to get killed. There's going to be political intrigue. And so there was not a clear line of succession that was figured out by King David. Another fault in his character, or again, maybe this is a later literary motif describing why kingship is bad, because there's a problem of succession. Now, primogeniture has not yet been the rule in Israel. It's not completely 100% established. Normally the firstborn male would succeed the king, but that has not been established yet, and that sort of locks you into the firstborn, whether he's good or bad. So this is just a fascinating way that First Kings starts out with this search for a young virgin to sleep with the king. Doesn't seem like a very profound religious or theological message. Now, Adonijah was the oldest, and he has sort of set himself up as king. He was the oldest, the next in line, and the text tells us that he sort of starts becoming king while David is still alive. He does some of the actions, leading others to think he is the king, but then Bathsheba and Nathan come and they sort of have to remind David that he promised or should appoint Solomon as king, which again, the text is clear that it's really not David's doing. He's really being compelled. He's very old. He's very fragile. And then he says, well, yes, have Solomon anointed by the prophet Nathan. So oil, sweet smelling oil with herbs and other spices, and will be placed on his forehead, on his head, and he will ride his mule. Now they did have horses, but they weren't primarily ridden, and the mule was reserved for royalty. So now we have in chapter 2 of First Kings, Adonijah, the oldest son of David, requests Abishag the Shunammite as his wife. Remember, David had not had relations with her. Solomon takes that as offensive, and so he puts Adonijah to death. So here we have the situation where one brother kills another brother in the struggle for succession to the throne. In chapter 3, Solomon marries a daughter of the Pharaoh of Egypt, it is said, and he had many of these marriages for the purpose of political allegiance. He has a dream, and in the Hebrew scriptures, many times God contacts people, Yahweh speaks to people in dreams. They're considered very important. Here, Solomon prays for wisdom. Chapter 3, verse 9, give your servant therefore an understanding mind to govern your people, able to discern between good and evil, for who can govern this, your great people? So he prays for wisdom, and Solomon is granted wisdom, and it's on the basis of texts like this that he is assumed to be the author of Book of Proverbs and other of the wisdom books in the Hebrew scriptures. Now, did he actually write them or not? Probably not. He probably was a king who collected this information, this knowledge. He had advisors from around the area internationally who could read and write this wisdom literature and serve as advisors to the throne. As an example of Solomon's wisdom, we have chapter 3, verse 16. Two women come before him. They're actually two prostitutes. And this is difficult to believe that the king would be deciding a case like this. This is probably purely literary. In any case, wisdom is shown by Solomon. He says, well, they're both claiming that the child is their own. They both want the child. And he says, oh, well, we'll cut it in half. And no, the real mother says, no, don't do that. I'd rather have the child alive in the care of the other woman. And so Solomon realizes that's the true mother. So it's a parable, It's one of the few instances that try to prove the intelligence and wisdom of Solomon. However, if we look at this, we can see something similar to David. How really wise of a ruler is Solomon? He makes many mistakes. He overburdens his people with taxes and forced labor. He begins to allow the worship of other gods, especially with his wives. So this reputation of him being this absolutely wise leader, directed by Yahweh to be king over the people, anointed, doesn't really pan out in reality. It's sort of an ideology, it's a myth. Just as David was this great warrior and conqueror, Solomon is said to be this great builder and wise man. Well, if you look more deeply at the text, you see he doesn't really seem to live up to that tradition of him being the wisest man on earth. In 4 verse 26, it is said Solomon had 40,000 stalls of horses for his chariots. Again, that's wholly hyperbole. That is most likely just a total exaggeration. Those are Egypt and Babylon size numbers. They're making Solomon look good. He sends to Lebanon to get the wood for his temple. Chapter 5, verse 6, therefore command that cedars from Lebanon be cut for me. So that's a very famous theme, that this beautiful wood from Lebanon comes down. And it seems the building of the temple was something that he employed artisans from all over the Near East, or local to Israel. Now, there's a description in 1 Kings of the temple, and one could say that the text is presenting this as here is this unique temple designed by Yahweh. It's commanded to be built in a certain way, but archaeology has told us that the temple as described here is really quite similar to the other temples that we have excavated. So this really is not especially unique temple, and many of the practices also at the temple were similar. Now, there also were other high places and temples throughout Israel, throughout the tribes, where worship and sacrifice occurred. So this was not yet the centralized area for all of Israel. Additionally, it is said that David originally got the space for the temple, which was a thrashing ground. And that seems a strange detail to bring up, but it probably is because no, this was never a holy site before. This was not a temple or a high place to any sort of Baal or Astarte or Ale or any other god. This is just a threshing floor. So we can look again at the question, why didn't David build the temple? And here we have the text say Solomon saying, my father David could not build a house because of the constant warfare, which now has ceased. But that actually contradicts 2 Samuel 7:1, where it said that the enemies of David were at rest. So a minor contradiction here. Chapter 5:13 says King Solomon conscripted forced labor out of all Israel, and the levy numbered 30,000 men. So the idea that the city of Jerusalem, the temple, was built with conscripted labor. So most people were farmers. So say 70 to 80% were farmers or pastoralists. So at some point they would be forced to walk to Jerusalem and work for several months in the off season. So this is very common in more primitive societies where there's forced labor under the king, and perhaps any other tribal leader as well would do that. But especially here we see this, and we see this will be something that perhaps is claimed that Solomon did too much of. In chapter 8, verse 10, we read, and when the priests came out of the holy place, a cloud filled the house of the Lord. So in this sense, the temple, at least for a lot of the writers in the Hebrew Scriptures, the temple is actually a place for the actual physical presence of Yahweh. It's not that this is just a church or synagogue or temple that you go to visit, to meditate in, or to address God, but there really was a very concrete physicalist sense that God is really here. This is the house of the Lord. God resides here physically. And this is very different than modern understandings of God as a spiritual being that is not located in space and time. Not like a person, not like a single person who occupies an area, a limited area of space and time. God is conceived that way in much of the Hebrew Scriptures, sort of as a human writ large, not as a universal being who sort of exists beyond time and space, can see what's happening in time and space and influence it, and is aware of it, is omniscient, and is aware of everything, and omnipotent, powerful enough to do anything in space and time, but who does not himself live within a house or live within the world. So cloud, I think of a dark, stormy kind of cloud, is very much associated with the presence of Yahweh. And also fire, we will see fire. So fire and smoke sort of go together. Thunderstorm and lightning go together. And this is sort of the awing sense of Yahweh. And here he is in the temple in Jerusalem. So it's really is seen as the house of Yahweh. In chapter 8, verse 35, we read, when heaven is shut up and there is no rain because they have sinned against you. So Solomon is talking, and when the people have sinned against God, God will withhold the rain. So this is as old as anything in religion and as universal as anything in religion. People pray for the rain, for their crops, for their sustenance, for their life. They need the rain on a yearly basis. A famine is going to be very tough in any society that does not have the capacity to move food from hundreds of miles away or have refrigeration. This is absolutely essential, and I think we all understand this. People even to this day will pray to God for the rain. But here we have a sense here that they really did not understand meteorology. They are thinking that there's no rain because they have sinned against God. And one of the primary sins is going to be worship of the other gods in the area. And which is sort of ironic because that was really endemic. The other gods were always present there, from the peasant to the king and the king's wives. Other gods were worshipped, were called upon. And we can make a theological point. Why is that so bad? These other gods, the Baals, the various names for Baal, for Lord, in the Canaanite and other religions, or Astarte, the female gods, and many of them are consorts of Baal or El. What is so bad about them? We have a sense that these gods are demonic and evil, but they were just names for very similar deities to Yahweh. These were gods worshipped in temples or on high places. They provided the rain, and they are also the war gods of these other societies. So the Hebrew scriptures lack a sense of looking at these various names of various gods as just names for one and the universal God. We tend to look at the Hebrew scriptures as being very monotheistic, and that does not really fit with what we are actually seeing in the text. It's very henotheistic, as I've said. There's not a sense that there really is only one God, only one creator, and that that is a universal God accessible to all people in some ways. No, this is very much a tribal God, a national God who looks after his own people. Not all people, just his people. And the other gods are not to be worshipped. But there's no claim that other people should come in to be part of Israel. It's just that God is a jealous God. Not that these other gods don't exist. So it really affects your sense of tribal identity. And your identity with your group is really important. And which God you claim is a symbol and the actual reality of which society you belong to. So it has to deal with your loyalty to God. And that's what love often means in these texts. Love your God with all your heart and all your might and all your strength. That means be loyal to this God. So it's a sense of loyalty, and that directly translates over to loyalty to your society. So which God you have is really a statement of which society you are a member of. So if someone else is worshiping these other gods, well, the rain is going to stop. Yahweh is going to be angry, and you are not going to be perceived as fully at one with the ideology of the group. In chapter 9, Yahweh appears to Solomon. And in 9:4, Yahweh says, as for you, if, so it's a conditional, if you will walk before me, as David your father walked, then I will establish your royal throne over Israel forever, as I promised to your father David. So here we have an interesting uh, difference that the promise of this everlasting throne is conditional. It's not just a blank check. It's not an unconditional promise of an eternal throne. It's conditional upon if you will walk before me. So if you will do what Yahweh wants, if you will not worship other gods, if you will follow the various laws, then you will have this eternal kingship. But if not, it mentions that Yahweh will, he says, I will cut Israel off from the land that I have given you. And even the temple, this house will become a heap of ruins. And why? Why would this occur? Because they have forsaken Yahweh, their God, who brought them out of Egypt, and embraced other gods, worshiping them and serving them. And then that is why God brings disaster on the temple. So there has to be an explanation for why that is the case. But here we have a sense that the people would or could embrace other gods. There's no real teaching here that other gods don't exist. It is clear that there are other gods and that people worship them. And for the time, that makes sense. Every society had their own totem, their own symbolic, emblematic god who is sort of a representative of their society. And there's no argumentation that either they do not exist or that they are just different names for the one universal God. But you see, all of these specific gods, Baal, Shemosh, Molech, they are all the great providers and protectors of each individual society. So you really can't say that there is just one God, because your God is almost instrumental. Almost you're using God as an instrument or tool to support your society. God gives you the rain. It doesn't matter about rain anywhere else in the world, right? God doesn't, Yahweh isn't, that's not part of Yahweh's job. It's just to provide rain here for Israel, and to help win Israel's wars. So the problem here is that how do you get out of that particular limited exclusivistic God into a more universal God? And when you have such a tribal national identity and your religion is really connected with it, it's very hard to do, because the function of your God is to support your society. And it's very hard to get to a more universal, inclusive understanding of divinity or the nature of the divine. In chapter 11, we have a summing up of Solomon's reign, and the summing up is very theological. King Solomon loved many foreign women, along with the daughter of Pharaoh. So the daughter of Pharaoh is mentioned, but there are many more: Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Hittite, from the nations concerning which the Lord had said to the Israelites. So this is what the Lord had said, and this is generally the hopes of some of the writers. You shall not enter into marriage with them, neither shall they with you, for they will surely incline your heart to follow their gods. Well, Solomon clung to those he loved. Among his wives were 700 princesses and 300 concubines. So, and they turned away his heart, the text tells us. So 1,000 wives and concubines, 1,000. And that may be an exaggeration, but perhaps not far from the truth. He probably had dozens and dozens. And many of them were with to cement political alliances and to sort of create a more upper ruling class that was connected, and which is beneficial in preventing wars and increasing trade, increasing understanding. You're becoming more of a diverse, universal society where you have connections with these others. So perhaps that helps with diplomacy. For when Solomon was old, his wives turned away his heart after other gods. So his heart went to other gods. This is Solomon. And his heart was not true to Yahweh, as was the heart of his father David. So this is, I guess, one good thing for David, according to the text. He was just a Yahweh worshiper, although, as we've seen, his reign was typified by a lot of mistakes. For Solomon followed Astarte, or Astarte, the goddess of the Sidonians, and Milcom, and he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and did not completely follow Yahweh as David had done. And Solomon built a high place for Shemosh, the abomination of Moab, and for Molech, the abomination of the Ammonites, on the mountain east of Jerusalem. He did the same for all his foreign wives who offered incense and sacrifice to their gods. So he built all these besides building the temple, he built these other temples to these other divinities. Astarte was very popular with the Phoenicians um, and around Tyre and Sidon. So here it's interesting. The societies, many of the societies around Israel had female deities along with male deities. Where they were more directly polytheistic, whereas Israel was more henotheistic, just one God, just Yahweh. But these other societies had these female images for the divine, and many of them deal with fertility. They deal with, well, what is fertility? Fertility would both be human fertility, having babies, and also agricultural fertility, animal husbandry fertility. So you want your animals to have many births. You want your fields to grow. You want rain. You want fertility. The processes of life are so important for human life and human civilization. So these gods are thought of as providers and enablers of whatever is needed for life. Whereas the God of Israel, Yahweh, is also seen with some of those functions, providing rain and providing births of people and animals. But also Yahweh is very much a warrior god, and we've talked about that before. But why fertility gods are so important is because these people are immersed in a natural life, and fertility means the bringing forth of natural life. So what is going to happen is there's going to be a divided kingdom. The northern tribes are going to be separate from Judah, or Judah slash Benjamin. Um, the punishment that Yahweh metes out is that Solomon will only have one tribe for his son. So this is the idea of why these historical things why these historical events have happened, is because you were not faithful to Yahweh. So they're always looking for that theological explanation. And this we could look at this theory of biblical interpretation. This is so embarrassing to Solomon and Israel and the kingship that this would be hard to be thought of as a lie or a myth. So probably, if we want to look at historically, there probably was a King Solomon, and probably son of David, and he had some of his siblings killed. And so he probably did have and allow worship of these other deities. He was very international, and he was married, and this probably is something that did occur, because anything so embarrassing to the text would be removed if any way it could, but there's no way to remove this. So that is what happens, and whether or not it was the cause of the divided kingdom, that's what we're going to see further on in King.